we've lost one of baseball's most colorful characters. Former Yankee infielder and manager Billy Martin is dead at the age of 61.
But there's no doubt a sudden loss and a tragic and a useless loss is definitely in the category beyond shock. And my wife and I will miss him terribly.
Billy Martin was one of baseball's fiercest winners, but the sad truth about his death exposed years of chaos that followed him even after he was gone. He was a five-time manager of the storied New York Yankees, loved his fire and his will to win. On December 25, 1989, that fire went out forever. Martin died at age 61 in a sudden crash near his own farm in Fenton, New York. The crash happened on Christmas Day. The police first said his friend William Reedy was driving. Reedy later said Martin was behind the wheel instead. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. That single question turned into one of the strangest mysteries in baseball history. Who was really driving the truck that night? The official story named William Reedy as the driver. The Reedy was a 53-year-old bar owner from Detroit and Martin's friend for 25 years. He was charged with driving while intoxicated right after the crash. Then, months later, Reedy said something shocking. He said Martin had actually been the one driving. As we uncover how this story changed, use the hype feature and give this video some hype so more baseball fans can hear the truth. Reedy's news story spread fast. People were used to hearing wild stories about Martin. He had a long history of drinking, fighting, and getting fired. So the idea that he died drunk behind the wheel fit the picture many people already had of him. But statements from people can change. The evidence inside a truck cannot. The blood does not lie. Broken glass does not lie. Injuries on a body do not lie. While Reedy kept changing his answer, doctors and investigators were quietly building a different kind of proof. That proof would take years to fully come out. It would also lead to lawsuits, a criminal trial, and a bitter fight over millions of dollars between the people Martin left behind. This video walks through what really happened on that icy road, what the evidence showed, and why the truth took so long to settle. We will save the full forensic details for later, so each piece of evidence gets the attention it deserves. First, let's go back to Christmas Day and see how the night began. It started as an ordinary holiday at Martin's home in Fenton, New York. Martin and his wife, Jill Martin, were hosting old friends. William Reedy and his wife, Carol, had come to visit. Reedy owned a saloon in Detroit. He and Martin had been close friends for about 25 years. Christmas at the farm was meant to be a quiet, relaxed day away from the pressure of baseball, travel, and public life. During the afternoon, Martin and Reedy decided to leave the house and run some errands. They ended up at Maury's Bar and Restaurant on Front Street in Binghamton, New York. The two men stayed there for about 4 hours. During that time, they drank a large amount of alcohol. Martin was not just any customer. He was a famous face, and the staff knew about his heavy drinking and his short temper. Because of that, employees kept a close eye on the two men all afternoon. The 4 hours is a long stretch of time to spend at a bar on Christmas Day, and it meant the two friends had plenty of time to drink well past what would be considered safe for driving home afterward. As the visit went on, the bartender, a man named Robert Dunlop, grew concerned about who would drive home. He asked the two friends directly who would be behind the wheel for the trip back. This was not a small or routine question. It was a direct attempt to prevent exactly the kind of accident that would happen only a short time later. Reedy answered by holding up the keys to Martin's leased 1989 Ford pickup truck. That simple action told everyone in the bar that Reedy planned to be the driver. The restaurant manager, Al Raimondi, and other staff members later said the same thing. They said Reedy appeared to be in better shape to drive than Martin was. That does not mean Reedy was sober. Tests taken after the crash would later show that his blood alcohol level was above the legal limit. It only means that compared to Martin, he seemed more able to handle the wheel. In a way, this was a comparison between two men who had both been drinking heavily, not a judgment that either one was actually fit to get behind the wheel that night. Reedy was not a stranger passing through town. He had known Martin for a quarter of a century. Their friendship had survived Martin's fame, his temper, and his constant moves from city to city. The Reedy ran his own bar back in Detroit, so he understood the world of late nights and heavy drinking better than most people. That familiarity may be part of why nobody in the group seemed alarmed as the afternoon stretched into a 4-hour visit at Maury's. This was simply how the two old friends chose to spend their holiday together. Still, the staff at Maury's paid close attention. Billy Martin was not an ordinary customer walking in off the street. He was one of the most recognizable men in baseball, a 5-time Yankees manager whose drinking habits and short fuse had been written about for years. When a man with that kind of reputation sits at your bar for hours, you notice? The bartender and the manager both kept track of how much the two friends were drinking, and both later confirmed that neither man looked entirely sober by the time they were ready to leave. Shortly before 5:30 in the evening, the two men left the bar and began the drive back to the farm. What happened next would turn a quiet holiday into a tragedy that baseball fans would argue about for decades. Night had already fallen by the time they left Binghamton. The temperature outside was brutally cold. Broome County's winding country roads were covered in ice and packed snow, the kind of conditions that turn an easy drive into a dangerous one. Even a careful, experienced driver would have struggled on those roads that night. The darkness hid the curves ahead, and packed snow hid solid ice underneath it, creating conditions that gave almost no warning before a vehicle began to slide. Somewhere along the route, the driver missed the main highway exit that would have led straight back to the farm. Instead of turning around and finding the highway again, the driver chose a different path. That path ran through Hunt Hill Road and Potter Hill Road, a stretch of local roads that were unlit, hilly, and far more hazardous than the highway would have been. There were no streetlights on this stretch, and the hills rolled sharply up and down, making it even harder to keep control of a heavy truck on ice. Around 5:45 in the evening, the truck turned left onto Potter's Field Road, also known as Potter Hill Road, and then tried to make an immediate right turn into Martin's own driveway. That turn never happened cleanly. It was a fast, tight maneuver on a road already coated in ice, exactly the kind of turn that leaves almost no room for error. The ice took over. The heavy 3/4-ton pickup truck lost all traction on the slick road. It slid right past the brick entry columns marking the entrance to the farm, columns that carried Martin's own initials, a detail that made the crash feel even more tragic since the truck came so close to reaching home safely. Instead of stopping in the driveway, the truck kept sliding into a drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. The truck struck a concrete culvert at the base of the driveway with a violent head-on impact. Neither man was wearing a seatbelt that night, a choice that would end up playing a major role in how each man was injured. The force of the crash was not spread evenly through the cab. Most of the violent energy landed on the passenger side, where Billy Martin was sitting. Billy Martin was thrown forward and to the right, slamming into the passenger side dashboard and then into the windshield. The injuries to his head and neck from that impact would prove to be fatal. William Reedy survived the crash, but he did not walk away untouched. He suffered a fractured hip, several cracked ribs, and deep cuts across his face, injuries serious enough to require significant medical care of his own. In the terrifying seconds before the crash, as the truck began sliding out of control, Martin reportedly said just 2 words: "Hold on." Those would be among his final words. The short, simple warning, spoken as the wheels lost their grip on the ice, was the last thing anyone heard him say. What came next for investigators was a long, difficult search for the truth about who had actually been steering that truck. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the crash scene, Reedy gave them a clear answer right away. He told them that he had been driving, based on that statement, along with tests that showed his blood alcohol level was above the legal limit of 0.1%. Reedy was charged with driving while intoxicated. The scene with Martin badly injured and Reedy himself in pain from his own injuries, there was little reason for deputies to doubt what they were being told. At that point, the story seemed simple and settled. Reedy had been drinking. The Reedy had been driving. He lost control on the icy back roads, and his best friend paid for it with his life. For many people, this version made complete sense. Billy Martin's public image had been shaped by years of hard drinking, loud arguments, and constant turmoil, both on and off the field. The story, where Martin himself might have been the reckless one behind the wheel, almost seemed too obvious to question. It fit neatly into everything people already believed about him, and for a while, almost nobody questioned it. But a story being easy to believe does not make it true. In April of 1990, 4 months after the crash, the case took a sharp turn that would keep this mystery alive for years to come. William Reedy suddenly changed his story. In an interview published by the Detroit Free Press, Reedy said that Billy Martin had actually been the one driving the truck that night, not him. He admitted that he had lied to the deputies at the scene. This was a stunning reversal from the account he had given right after the crash, and it instantly reopened the entire question of who had really been behind the wheel. Reedy explained his reasoning. He said that right after the crash, he believed Martin was only unconscious, not dead. The Reedy knew how intense the scrutiny on Martin already was, especially given his rocky on and off relationship with Yankees owner George Steinbrenner. The Reedy claimed he lied to protect his friend from yet another career-ending scandal, thinking Martin would wake up and they could sort it out quietly. In his mind, taking the blame for the accident might have seemed like a small favor between old friends, one he assumed would never actually matter. That explanation did not last long. Later that same day, a rival paper, the Detroit News, reached out to Reedy for comment. This time, Reedy denied everything. He claimed he had never spoken to the Free Press at all. He refused to say anything further, telling reporters that his lawyer had advised him to stay silent. In the space of a single day, 2 different newspapers had printed 2 completely different versions of the same man's story. Within a single day, Reedy had gone from confessing that he lied to denying he ever said any of it. This back and forth created the perfect environment for rumors and conspiracy theories to grow. Why did Martin's story keep changing? Why did so many people believe Martin was driving even years later? Reporters and fans were left with more questions than answers, and that uncertainty gave the story a life of its own. In 1994, those theories were given a much bigger platform. The author Peter Golenbach published a biography called Wild High and Tight: The Life and Death of Billy Martin. In the book, Golenbach argued that Martin had been the driver all along. He went further, alleging that Jill Martin and Reedy had worked together to cover up the truth in order to protect Martin's public reputation and to help secure a future insurance payout. The book reached a wide audience, and its claims became part of how many fans remembered Martin's death from that point forward. The books like this carry a lot of weight in the public imagination. A well-researched biography, written with confidence and detail, can feel more convincing than a short newspaper correction or a quiet court filing. That is part of why Golenbach's version of events spread so widely, even though it was built on allegation rather than confirmed fact. Many readers walked away from that book believing they had learned the true story, when in reality they had only learned one author's theory about what might have happened. The A theory, presented with enough detail and confidence, can start to feel like settled history even when it never was. It is important to be clear here. This was an allegation from a book, not a proven fact. No official finding ever confirmed that Jill Martin took part in any cover-up. The claim came from Golenbach's own reporting and his own conclusions, and it should be treated that way, as a theory rather than a settled fact. Even so, the theory stuck. Years later, in 2004, Reedy again said publicly that Martin had been the driver. By that point, he said there was no longer any reason to keep covering for his deceased friend. Martin's own son, Billy Martin Jr., eventually accepted this version of events as well, publicly saying he believed his father had been driving. The A's son, choosing to believe his father died at the wheel rather than as a passenger, says a great deal about how deeply this story had settled into the family's own understanding of that night. So why did this version of the story survive for so long, even after physical evidence pointed somewhere else? Part of the answer lies in who Billy Martin actually was, and the reputation he had built over a lifetime in baseball. Martin's talent on the field was never really in question, but off the field, his personality could be explosive. He was known for getting into bar fights. He argued constantly with umpires. He clashed with players in the clubhouse. He feuded with owners, and at times he even turned on close friends. The anger seemed to follow him everywhere he went, even into rooms where he was supposed to be celebrating a win. His most famous professional relationship was with Yankees owner George Steinbrenner. Over the years, Steinbrenner hired Martin as manager 5 separate times. Each time, Martin would turn a struggling team around through sheer will and baseball instinct. He had a gift for pushing players to perform better than anyone expected. Each time, some new blow-up, some new controversy, or some new drinking incident would lead Steinbrenner to fire him all over again. Then, because Martin could win, Steinbrenner would eventually bring him back. It became a strange, repeating cycle that baseball fans watched play out again and again, almost like a soap opera that never really ended. No other manager in Yankees history experienced anything close to that pattern of being fired and rehired by the same owner so many times. One of the clearest examples of Martin's self-destructive streak happened back in 1978. The frustrated and angry, Martin publicly criticized both Steinbrenner and star player Reggie Jackson, saying the two of them deserve each other. One's a born liar and the other's convicted. That single comment effectively ended that stretch of his time as Yankees manager. It also became one of the most quoted lines of his entire career, a perfect example of how his own words could destroy the very job he had fought so hard to keep. This pattern, brilliant baseball mind paired with constant personal chaos, became Martin's public identity. People had watched him self-destruct in public so many times that a story about him drinking and driving on Christmas night did not seem far-fetched at all. His own reputation made the rumor easy to believe, even when it was not what the evidence showed. In a strange way, the very thing that made Martin such a compelling figure, his unpredictable temper, also made it easy for the public to assume the worst about how he died. The sports media played a role in this as well. Journalists who had spent years covering Martin's outbursts, his firings, and his comebacks were already primed to see his death as one more chapter in a familiar story. The A headline about baseball's most volatile manager dying in a drunk driving crash fit the narrative arc that reporters and fans had followed for over a decade. That familiarity made the darker version of the story spread faster and stick harder than the more complicated truth that investigators were still working to uncover. Once a version of a story fits so cleanly with someone's public image, it tends to travel farther and faster than a more careful, evidence-based account ever could. Because personal stories and public reputation could not settle the question on their their own, investigators turned to something that could not lie or change its mind. They turned to the physical evidence left behind inside the wrecked truck. Forensic pathologists and accident reconstruction experts set aside the conflicting statements and focused on medical and physical proof instead. Unlike memories or interviews, physical evidence does not change with time, and it does not depend on what someone chooses to say to a reporter. The lead forensic authority involved was Dr. Michael Baden, the former chief medical examiner of New York City. The Baden was a veteran forensic pathologist who had worked on major investigations for the United States Congress Select Committee on Assassinations, as well as for the New York State Police. His background gave his conclusions serious weight in this case. Baden's reconstruction of the inside of the truck's cab led him to a clear conclusion. William Reedy, not Billy Martin, had been operating the truck at the moment of impact. That conclusion rested on 3 separate areas of evidence, and each one deserves a closer look. The first area involved the location of Martin's injuries on his own body. Martin's autopsy showed that his fatal injuries were concentrated heavily on the right side of his head, neck, and torso. He suffered severe blunt force trauma to the right side of his skull, along with a high-speed compression fracture in his neck. The A compression fracture happens when a bone is crushed under sudden powerful force rather than simply bent or snapped. The investigators pay close attention to details like this because the exact side of the body that is injured in a violent crash can reveal exactly where a person had actually been sitting inside a vehicle. This exact pattern of injury matched what would happen to a passenger sitting on the right side of the truck cab. During a violent crash like this one, a passenger on that side would be thrown forward and to the right directly into the passenger door, the dashboard, and the support post beside the windshield, known as the A-pillar. Every part of that description lines up with where Martin's body was actually injured. There was no need to guess or assume anything. The pattern spoke for itself. Once investigators laid it out clearly, now compare that to what a driver's injuries would look like. The driver's seat sits directly behind the steering wheel and steering column. If Martin had truly been driving, investigators would have expected to see specific chest or stomach injuries caused by his body being thrown into the steering wheel. Those particular injuries were completely absent from Martin's body. That absence mattered a great deal because it is exactly what an investigator would expect to find missing if Martin had been sitting on the passenger side instead. In forensic work, what is missing from a body can be just as telling as what is actually found on it. The second area of evidence came from the windshield itself and from trace biological material left behind after the crash. Technicians who examined the wrecked truck mapped out exactly where the glass had been struck. The passenger side of the windshield showed severe outward bowing, along with a star-shaped cracking pattern. That kind of damage is caused by a direct head strike, the sort of impact that happens when a person's skull hits glass with great force. The investigators use this kind of glass damage constantly in crash reconstruction because it shows precisely where the force of a body's impact was concentrated. When investigators searched that exact impact zone on the passenger side, they recovered hair fragments and traces of blood. DNA testing and physical comparison confirmed that these biological materials belonged to Billy Martin. Just as important, no biological trace material belonging to Martin was ever found on the driver's side windshield, and none was found on the steering wheel assembly either. In simple terms, Martin's head hit the passenger side of the truck. It never touched the driver's side at all. That single detail alone made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to seriously argue that Martin had been driving. This kind of trace evidence is powerful precisely because it cannot be influenced by anyone's memory or motive. A person can decide to tell a different story to a reporter. Hair and blood cannot decide anything. Once that biological material was tested and matched, it created a fixed point of fact that every later statement, no matter how convincing, would eventually have to be measured against. Even a well-told story from a trusted friend could not undo what the lab results had already confirmed. The third area of evidence had to do with how the two men's bodies moved during the actual crash. Since neither man was wearing a seatbelt, their movement inside the cab was controlled entirely by the physics of a sudden stop. When the truck slammed into the concrete culvert, the vehicle itself came to an instant halt. The two men inside kept moving forward at the speed the truck had been traveling just before impact, because a moving body wants to keep moving until something stops it. On the driver's side, the steering wheel worked like a barrier. It caught Reedy's body as he was thrown forward, stopping his momentum but causing his hip fracture and his cracked ribs in the process. That kind of injury is common in crashes where a driver is thrown into the wheel. On the passenger side, there was no steering wheel to stop Martin's forward motion. With nothing in his way, he was thrown much further forward, straight into the glove box, the dashboard, and finally the right side windshield. That unobstructed path is exactly what led to the fatal fracture in his neck. Every injury on both men fit neatly into this same physical explanation. information. Taken together, these three areas of evidence, the injury pattern, the windshield and biological evidence, and the physics of how each body moved, all pointed to the same conclusion. The forensic record placed William Reedy behind the wheel and Billy Martin in the passenger seat at the moment the truck struck the culvert. The statements from witnesses could shift and change over the years, depending on memory, fear, or loyalty. This physical evidence could not shift at all. It stayed exactly the same no matter who told a different story afterward. That consistency is what gave investigators confidence in their final conclusion. That does not mean everyone simply accepted the forensic findings and moved on. The rumor that Martin had been driving continued to circulate for years, long after this evidence became part of the public record. Some people trusted personal stories over scientific findings, especially when those personal stories fit the version of Martin they already believed in. The powerful reputation, built over decades, can be harder to shake than any single piece of forensic proof, even when that proof is thorough and consistent. Of course, physical evidence and courtroom outcomes are two different things, and Martin's death would move through the legal system in ways that were just as complicated as the forensic investigation itself. The Broome County District Attorney, Gerald Mullen, reviewed the case and decided not to bring vehicular manslaughter charges to a grand jury. The vehicular manslaughter is a serious criminal charge, and it requires proof that a driver acted with a level of carelessness that goes well beyond an ordinary accident. His office concluded that there simply was not enough evidence to meet the legal standard of criminal negligence required for a homicide conviction. The driving while intoxicated charge, however, moved forward, since the blood alcohol test results were clear and direct. The following a jury trial, Reedy was found guilty of operating the pickup truck while intoxicated. This decision by the district attorney is worth pausing on. It shows an important difference in how the legal system treats different kinds of driving offenses. Driving while intoxicated focuses on whether a driver's blood alcohol level was above the legal limit, a fact that can be proven with a simple test. The vehicular manslaughter requires proving something much harder, that the driver's actions were reckless enough to amount to a crime resulting in death. Even with a fatal crash and a confirmed intoxication charge, prosecutors did not believe they could clear that higher bar in court. The difference between these two charges would matter a great deal once the civil lawsuits began. That criminal conviction did not end the case. Instead, it set off a much larger chain of civil lawsuits, the kind of lawsuits designed to determine who owes money for a loss rather than who goes to jail. Jill Martin, acting as executrix of her late husband's estate, filed a wrongful death lawsuit along with a claim for conscious pain and suffering. An executrix is simply the person who is legally responsible for managing someone's estate after they pass away. She named 3 defendants in her lawsuit: William Reedy, the town of Fenton, and Ford Motor Credit Company, the company that had leased the truck to Martin in the first place. Naming 3 separate defendants meant the case would involve 3 different legal teams, each with its own interest in how the driver question was ultimately decided, and each prepared to argue its own side of the story in court. Jill Martin's legal team tried a clever strategy to speed things up. They argued that because a criminal jury had already found Reedy guilty of driving while intoxicated, that same jury had essentially already decided he was the driver. Using a legal idea called collateral estoppel, they asked the court to treat that question as already settled, so it would not need to be argued again in the civil trial. In simple terms, collateral estoppel means that once a fact has been proven in one court case, a party involved in that case cannot argue against that same fact again in a later case. It saves time and prevents the same argument from being fought over and over in different courtrooms. This question eventually reached New York's Appellate Division, 3rd Department, in the 1994 case known as Martin v. Reedy. This was a significant ruling because it did not just decide who was liable for Martin's death. It also helped clarify how far collateral estoppel could reach when more than one defendant is involved. The court's decision came down to 2 major points. First, the court agreed that collateral estoppel applied directly to Reedy himself. Since Reedy had already been proven to be the driver in his own criminal case, he could not turn around and argue otherwise in the civil case. That part of the ruling was straightforward. However, the court ruled that this same rule could not simply be extended to the town of Fenton or to Ford Motor Credit Company, even though both were named in the same lawsuit. The court explained that the kind of liability placed on vehicle owners under New York's vehicle and traffic law did not automatically connect those defendants closely enough to Reedy's own criminal case. In other words, just because Reedy was found guilty in his own trial did not mean the town or the leasing company had been given a fair chance to argue that point themselves. Blocking them from arguing the driver question directly would take away their constitutional right to a fair trial on that issue. The judges even admitted that having only one of 3 defendants bound by why this rule would make jury instructions extremely difficult, since jurors would essentially need to treat the same question two different ways for different parties in the same trial. Even so, they decided that protecting each defendant's right to argue their own case mattered more than avoiding a confusing trial. Second, the court upheld the dismissal of the estate's claim for conscious pain and suffering. Under New York law, a family can only collect money for a loved one's suffering after an accident if there is proof that the person was actually aware of what was happening to them. This is a difficult standard to meet because it requires clear medical evidence, not just assumptions about what a dying person may have felt. The coroner's report stated that Martin's cause of death was an immediate neck fracture combined with spinal cord compression, an injury severe enough to end awareness almost instantly. Both Reedy and the first responders who reached the scene confirmed that Martin never regained consciousness after the impact. Because of that, the court found there was no evidence he had suffered consciously after the crash. The court also rejected a related claim involving fear in the moments before the crash. Martin's final words, "Hold on," spoken as the truck began sliding at a fairly low speed, were not considered enough proof that he understood he was about to die. The court reasoned that a warning like that could reflect simple caution during a skid, rather than a clear understanding that death was seconds away. This distinction between ordinary caution and true awareness of impending death shaped how the court viewed those final two words. With the criminal case closed and the legal questions from the appellate court resolved, attention shifted toward the money at stake, and that is where the Martin family conflict became even more painful. In early 1995, the different lawsuits connected to Martin's death came together into one global wrongful death settlement totaling $5 million. That money came from two sources: Ford Motor Credit's insurance company and William Reedy's own personal liability insurance provider, both of which had a financial stake in the outcome of the earlier legal rulings. For a family already worn down by years of legal proceedings, this settlement should have offered some closure. Instead, it opened up an entirely new front in the conflict. As soon as that settlement became final, it exposed deep cracks within Martin's own family. On one side stood his widow, Jill Martin. On the other stood his two children from earlier marriages, Billy Joe Martin and Kelly Martin. The dispute that followed would drag the family back into court for another year. Back in March of 1990, only a few months after Martin's funeral, Jill had already told the children that the estate was completely insolvent. She claimed that outstanding debts, including a $290,415 tax lien from the IRS and other liabilities totaling $941,233.07, left almost nothing behind. According to her, the trust set aside for Martin's children contained a mere $8.82. For two children who had just lost their father, that news was a second blow, arriving only weeks after they had buried him. That claim was met with real skepticism from the children and from people close to the family. Skepticism that would only grow stronger as more details about Martin's actual income came to light. Martin had grown up poor in Berkeley, California, but he had spent decades afterward as a highly paid major league manager and a genuine celebrity. A very different life from the one he had known as a child. In his final years, he earned royalties tied to Western wear stores, collected appearance fees, drew a personal salary as a special consultant to George Steinbrenner, and made money from a private ham production business on the side. Taken together, these were not small sources of income. They painted a picture of a man with real earning power right up until his death, which made the claim of an almost completely empty estate difficult for many people to square with what they knew about his life. The biographer Peter Golenbach and several family friends pointed out that while Martin certainly lived an expensive lifestyle and was known for handing out unpaid personal loans to almost anyone who asked, the idea that his estate held absolutely nothing was hard for many people to accept. Living expensively and owing debts is one thing. Having a trust with less than $9 in it after a lifetime of celebrity income is another thing entirely. This disbelief fueled rumors about hidden assets or some kind of financial manipulation behind the scenes. It is worth noting clearly that those particular rumors were never proven. No court finding in the supplied record confirmed that Jill Martin or anyone else had hidden money from the children, and the true state of the estate's finances remained a subject of dispute rather than settled fact. When the $5 million settlement finally came through, Billy Joe Martin took action. He petitioned Judge John Thomas of the Broome County Surrogates Court in Binghamton, claiming that he and his sister had been deliberately kept in the dark about the settlement negotiations. That claim, if true, meant the children had almost no say in how their father's estate was being handled, even though the money at stake was meant to compensate them for his death. In January of 1996, Judge Thomas presided over a trial to determine exactly how the settlement money should be split. Based on the actual financial loss each family family member had suffered. Jill Martin's legal team pushed to secure the large majority of the funds for her, leaning in part on a drafted but unsigned will from January of 1990 that favored her position. Because that will was never signed, it did not carry the same legal weight as a completed document, but it still became an important piece of evidence in the courtroom. In the end, the judge ordered a specific division of the two, $5 million. Jill Martin received 60% of the total, based largely on her position and status as Martin's widow. Billy Joe Martin received 30% after the court found that he had proven both dependency on his father and a real loss of financial support. Kelly Martin received the remaining 10%, a figure the court based on her more limited history of financial support from her father. The legal and financial battles eventually came to an end, but they left a lasting mark on everyone connected to that Christmas night, including the man who had survived the crash and carried its weight for the rest of his life. For William Reedy, the accident brought a deep personal change. After the crash, he stopped drinking entirely, giving up the very habit that had shaped that terrible night. For 9 full years, he and his wife refused to put up a Christmas tree in their home, a quiet personal act of penance for what had happened on that holiday. Every year without that tree was a small, private reminder of the friend he had lost. They only broke that streak in 1998, after the birth of their first granddaughter brought a new reason for celebration back into their lives. That small family tradition, paused for nearly a decade, shows how deeply the crash had affected Reedy long after the courtrooms had closed and the settlement money had been paid out. Even with all of the forensic evidence pointing clearly toward Reedy as the driver, the alternative version of the story never fully disappeared. Martin's own son, Billy Martin Jr., ultimately chose to believe that his father had been behind the wheel that night. It is a reminder of something important. Personal belief and grief do not always follow the physical facts, especially after a sudden and painful loss. Sometimes a family chooses the version of a story that feels true to them, even when science points somewhere else. That gap between evidence and belief is part of what makes this story so unusual. Even decades later, today, Billy Martin rests in Gates of Heaven Cemetery in Valhalla, New York. His headstone sits only about 90 feet from the grave of Babe Ruth, two towering figures of Yankees history, resting close together in the same quiet ground. It is a fitting place for a man who spent his whole career chasing the same kind of greatness that Ruth once represented. Even in death, Martin remains tied to the sport that defined his entire life, surrounded by the history he fought so hard to be part of. Through all the shifting statements, the lawsuits, and the bitter family disputes, one thing never changed. Billy Martin remains remembered as one of baseball's fiercest competitors, a manager whose sheer will to win kept George Steinbrenner calling him back again and again, 5 separate times, no matter how many times things fell apart. That drive to win was real, and it was part of what made him one of the most talked about figures in Yankees history. Stories about that Christmas night may have shifted for years, statements changing from one interview to the next, but the physical record left behind inside that truck told its own steady, unchanging story, placing baseball's fiery competitor in the passenger seat at the very end of a long, restless, unforgettable career. That is the sad truth behind the Christmas day that ended one of baseball's most unforgettable lives.